Thank you, Heta, Phyllis, and Matti. We will continue the discussion on, we started also here a little bit about environmental defenders and their place in the society, but we will have more discussion on that in the last session. But now we will have a discussion in Indigenous peoples' land rights, about the challenges and opportunities, and I will invite Dorothée to moderate the panel discussions. We have Shankar Limbu from Nepal, Päivi Michael from Finland, from Finnfund, and also Oula-Antti Labba from Saami Council together with us. I will invite you all here. So please, Dorothée, the floor is yours.
So I'm here again to moderate this very interesting panel session. But as a starter, I want to mention that Indigenous people's right to land are so intertwined with the right to a healthy environment. In fact, what we see is that we need to discuss this topic for two main reasons. The first one is because Indigenous people are protecting their land for decades. But as we see it, in fact, they are also the ones the most impacted by environmental degradation and climate change, even though they are among the people who are the lead contributing to a CO2 emission. But the second reason is also because, as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous people have been really at the front line of advocating their rights, their human rights, to protect the environment, and that is for decades. So, in fact, the example of Indigenous people, leadership in environmental protection should be followed. So here I have the chance to have very good panelists who can discuss about their experience working either alongside Indigenous people or actively engaging in the struggle of protecting the environment. So as a first brief question, I hope you could introduce your work. First, I will give maybe the word to Shankar, and if you could say a few words about how you work in your organization and support the right of Indigenous people to land, and explain this for the audience. That would be great.
Thank you very much. Sevaro, greetings in my community language. I am a practicing lawyer from Nepal. I'm associated with an organization called LAHURNIP, and it's a human rights organizations working to protect, promote, and defend the indigenous people's rights in Nepal. And we are partnering with KIOS here, and we've been doing several activities to protect the indigenous peoples, especially the land rights, the collective rights, and human rights as well. And this organization, it was formed a long time ago in 1993 to protect the indigenous people's right. At that time, indigenous peoples were not recognized in Nepal. So there's some pioneer lawyers, they started thinking that how the indigenous peoples would be legally recognized, because the problem of indigenous peoples that they start from de-recognition of within the legal system. So they were not considered as a legal entity, so they did not have a rights, and so they didn't have the access to resources also, and access to justice, what we call. So that is starting. It was a good starting in the first place, so that the organization was successful to introduce a law in 2002 that recognized indigenous peoples in Nepal legally. That's how it started. But there are lots of historical injustices against indigenous peoples that need to be dealt amicably and legally. That's what we have been doing. This is one of the injustices is land displacement or displacement from land territories and natural resources that can be considered as a colonization to the indigenous peoples, and that's also linked to the human rights and also to the environment as well. Thank you.
I will give now the word for Oula-Antti Labba. You are a representative of the Saami Council, so could you please elaborate on the work that you are doing in respect to land rights?
Joo, Päivi puhka ja that is good day in my mother tongue, Saami language. Yes, so I worked recently in Saami Council in the Human Rights Unit, and as probably most of you know, Saami Council is I think the longest still existing indigenous organization that is established in 1956. And our work in Human Rights Unit of the Saami Council basically consists of two kind of major parts. First is the promoting indigenous rights in global level, and the second is promoting indigenous Saami people's rights in national level. And for example, promoting indigenous rights in global level, we participate in different kind of processes, especially in regard of the United Nations. Very important arenas are, for example, United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. And of course, we are, for example, giving statements in regard of periodic reviews on treaty bodies and so on. And in national level, in those nation states that borders are crossing the Saami land, we are trying to affect on the legislation that are concerned the rights of Saami as an indigenous people. And of course, we are then trying to assist Saami rights holders in different kind of cases that I think mostly are for example, land encroachment cases such as mining and for example, wind power plants and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like now to give the floor to Päivi. I know that usually we speak about the relationship between indigenous people and states, but there are also non-public actors, private actor, corporation, and organizations such as Finnfund, which have actually an important relationship with indigenous people. So if you could elaborate on that point, that would be nice.
Excuse me. Pleasure to be here. So I work for, it's a public development finance here, actually, Finnfund. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Finnfund. So we make development, we make investments in developing countries. So we are a financier, and we invest in developing countries only. So, yeah. Just to clarify on that first. So I'm an environmental and social advisor, and before we start any project in developing countries, we make a very comprehensive environmental and social due diligence assessment, which we call a gap assessment. This is against the International Finance Corporation's performance standards, which include the indigenous people. So there's 8 standards, and one of the standards is particularly dealing with indigenous people. It is quite comprehensive, but also in addition to that, we have realized there are some gaps. So we also make an additional human rights risk assessment before we invest in anything. So this we have developed a tool for this. It's been a long process, and it's quite a comprehensive tool, which also includes biodiversity and water and other environmental aspects, but mostly it's on human rights, and it's looking at the potential risks and impacts before you actually make the investment. So sometimes you can see that there's a need for additional human rights assessment, and then you do that. So a lot of our work is actually preventative and not reactive. But of course, then there are situations where things evolve, and we monitor these things throughout the lifetime of the project. So that's in short.
Thank you. Yeah, and from what you are explaining, I can actually draw my next question, which relates to the importance of asserting a right to a healthy environment. So I'm wondering if, Shankar, you could elaborate on how this right, what this right means for you in your work. How does it relate to the right to land and natural resources of indigenous people in Nepal? Is it a tool that is valuable or that has not been valuable?
Based on our experience in Nepal, the land rights is the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples, like across the world. Why it's a fundamental rights for the indigenous peoples, because every rights that is connected with the land rights. You cannot exercise the right to life without right to land, right? You cannot exercise your right to life with the dignity along with the identity that is guaranteed under the Nepalese constitution, but you cannot exercise that right unless you have the right to land. And also the indigenous peoples are the custodian of the land, and also they are the custodian of the natural resources. When we talk about the lands, we are talking about the holistic approach. We are talking about the surface, subsurface, and above the surface. And also we are talking about the natural resources, right? So when you talk about the indigenous peoples, the way of protecting land and protecting the nature, which is crucial, it's linked with the culture. For an example, I would like to share with the one indigenous community, which is the Magar indigenous community, live in the northern part of Nepal. They have like quite good populations. Actually, there are 59 indigenous peoples who are officially recognized in Nepal. So this community, they have a belief system that forest is their home. And the house they call is a cape. You know the difference, right? The house, what we call the home, that's the different, but they call the forest is a home, right? So that's why, that's how that we can understand how they take care of the forest and natures, right, in their culture. Let me give you another example. There is a nomadic group which is called the Dorothée. The government agency, every year, they bring into the capital what they call that showing this community to the nation, right? And they meet Prime Minister, and then they have like meeting with the Prime Minister. And then every Prime Minister, when they come to visit, they say that they offer, why don't you settle in one place? Why do you roam in the forest, right? And they say, excuse me, Prime Minister, that's not the forest, that's our home. So we cannot stay in a city. When we came here 3 days, it's hard to breathe, but we can freely breathe in our place. That's why, and then how can I help you? Then clearly that the Dorothée chief says that, don't touch our home. We want to live freely. So that's why we have to understand that. Their way of life, if you think about the Dorothée people, what they do, they make wooden pot, and they cut down that kinds of trees which has no commercial values. That we think now that there are different models of protecting the forest that imposed by the government. One is the community forest. And the community forest is always looked from the economic perspective. The trees and resources are the, the commodity. But for this Dorothée community, for indigenous peoples, it is not the commodity, right? So you have the right to protect the home, and the home will protect you. That's kinds of customary law and belief system they have. This has to be recognized in the law, the national laws. Maybe this has to be recognized in international law when we talk about protecting the environment or nature, or protecting, that we are talking about how we can overcome from this impact of the climate change, right? So maybe these are the things when we talked about the land rights of indigenous peoples. This kinds of concept has to be understood by the policymaker, by the environmentalist, right? And also that, let me conclude with saying that one example. I want to talk about the protected areas that has been highlighted as a conservation, protecting the animals, right? So in our experience, what we have seen that there is one national park, Chiton National Park, you can Google it. It was established in 1950, and at that time, there was enumerated the one-horned rhinos, because that national park, the government established to protect that one-horned rhinoceros. Their population was 1,000. After establishing that national park, within 6 years, if you looked about the data, the population of one-horned rhinoceros dropped into the 360s. So whether these protected areas are protecting these natural resources or animal or indigenous peoples, we have to think about it, right? And now the government is saying that zero poaching area. I looked about their data. The population of one-horned rhinoceros is only 696. So that's why this is a serious question, whether indigenous peoples are protecting the nature, conservation, or this model of conservation is protecting, right? So that's why when we talk about this whole, the protecting nature, we have to think from the different perspective. This will benefit, not only I'm advocating the indigenous people's right, but what am I saying that if you are thinking about sustainable development, or if you are thinking about overcome or climate change resilience, it will give a different perspective to think about. I guess that this has been started. And let me think about it, that my organization worked to promote the international, the international laws such as like UN DRIP and ILO Convention 169 that Nepal is a party to. Now we are thinking that these two instruments can recognize indigenous people's rights and this kinds of system, especially as a right to be a custodian of land and natural resources that has to be implemented. Sorry if I take a long time. Sorry.
Well, thank you for highlighting those very valuable issues. And what I take also from what you are saying is clearly that the protection of indigenous people rights is also a move to protect the environment. And what we see is that at the international level, as you mentioned, there are already instruments such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, ILO Convention 169, which recognize the environmental rights of indigenous people. So those key instruments should be further protected and implemented by states and other actors. And I know that the Saami Council has been actually on the front line, historically speaking, to push for the adoption of those instruments. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on how you feel about the role of the human right to a healthy environment in your work. How does it relate to your work? Is it a tool that can be used by the Saami Council to further strengthen the right of the Saami people at the international level or a national level?
Yes, thank you. And I can echo with many of the issues that Shankar already brought in his speech. Indigenous land rights are one of the core rights of indigenous rights, and as you mentioned, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO Convention 169 are those legal instruments that recognized the rights, also the rights of indigenous peoples. And as we of course know, the current situation now in Scandinavia, that Norway has ratified the ILO 169 convention, but Finland and Sweden have not yet ratified it. And of course, I can say that the ratification process in Norway is kind of, I mean, even if the convention has been ratified, the implementation, of course, is still ongoing, and especially in regard of the land rights, there is this kind of a temporary solution which is called the Finnmark Act, and of course the right to healthy environment is kind of threatened in the recent situation. If we think, for example, that there are many mining plants that are targeting Saami lands all over Saami, in Swedish side, Finnish side, Norwegian side, and also in Russian side, in Kola Peninsula area, and as we know that how huge negative impact on clean and healthy environments this kind of large mines can have. They can pollute whole water systems, and of course many materials that mining or I say minerals that mining industries are trying to use. For example, uranium is very dangerous and can have very bad negative effects, and then we of course come to the plant rights issue. I can echo as Shankar mentioned that, and when the majority population come to your area, they are talking about forest. It's your home. It's kind of the same in Saami land, that for example in many acts and other official documents, in Finnish, it's most of the area that is in, for example, in the Saami home region in Finland, it's called erämaa. So I would translate it in English. It's wild mark, and it kind of gives this kind of idea that no one is kind of living there, but that's not true, because that's the home of Saami people and their reindeer, and it's the core foundation of the complete way of life of the Saami people.
Yes, again, very important issue that you are raising, and of course the issue is that in Finland we have legal framework that recognize the right of the Saami people, but as you mentioned yourself, either in Norway, in Sweden or Finland, the issue is always about implementation and how we make sure that those rights are respected in the development process. So this leads me to ask a little bit more about your work, because we see that one key issue in relation with the protection of land is also the issue of consultation in order to prevent that the damage already occurred. So I suppose that you follow specific guidelines, and you just were discussing the fact that you have specific guidelines in regards to development cooperation. So how far does it go, and what did you do in relation with the right of indigenous people, if anything?
Yes, there's always community engagement. So that's under the IFC performance standards that we apply. There is community engagement, that's the standard. But if there are indigenous people in the project area where we invest, then of course it is more comprehensive and very thorough. And there's an FPIC process, which is a free prior informed consultations. So all of this needs to be in place before you actually make investment decisions. But I'm inspired by my colleague here, so I would like to bring a positive comment to this, because I feel that Finnfund is in a position to actually make a difference with development finance. And when you talk about forestry, we actually invest a lot in forestry sector, and sometimes the national legislation is not as strict as what the international standards require. So it is also an opportunity for us to actually help and assist in situations where the law is not as strict or is not implemented, and you can use your leverage to actually help people, for example, with land rights, to do boundaries and help them with authorities to actually mark your property. So we've done that in Asia and in Africa.
As a follow-up question and more concrete question, I know that in some cases, unfortunately, free prior informed consent was not obtained because the legal framework of the national state is not strong enough, or the process was not. And I know about a specific case, which is the case of the construction of the wind farm Lake Turkana on Lake Turkana in Kenya, where Finnfund was investing. And in this case, a judge court in Kenya recognized that the process was not followed and that the land right of indigenous community was actually not respected, but the wind energy project was nevertheless built. So in that regard, once the damage is established, I'm wondering what is the responsibility, or what is the role of Finnfund in remedying those issues?
Yes, of course. No, it is. These are challenging environments, and they are not easy to work in always. And of course there is the remedy aspect if things go wrong. Yes, for sure.
Looking at the time, because we are already past. Do I have couple of minutes more. Yeah, so because I know remedy is such an important issue, because unfortunately we cannot prevent all damages. So I'm wondering if you had anything to add in relation with remedial mechanisms that could be used aside from court. Is there anything in your experience that can be used within the indigenous community to help remedy those damages?
Thank you very much. Important questions, right? Because when there is a human rights violations or indigenous people's rights violations or whatever the irregularities, that how we can get the remedies. There are two kinds of remedies in our context in Nepal. The one is formal, that is the state court. We bring a lot of litigation, and we have got a success in some cases, but not in all cases. There are so many technicalities. Another thing, from the access to justice perspective, the indigenous peoples, they are living in the remote area. And those state mechanisms, like a Supreme Court is in the capital, and the high courts are located in the city, even in the provincial courts, right? So the indigenous peoples living in those areas where there is no transportation, you have to walk like 3-4 days, then how can you ensure the access to justice? In that regard, the indigenous peoples, they have customary justice systems. That is not well recognized. So what we call in the legal term, these institutions are de facto recognized because these are functioning there generation to generation. They have easy access, they can deliver the justice. I'm not saying they are perfect. There are things that has to be, the change in the present context. But it's very easy. So that's why, let me give you the one example maybe that makes it clear. There was a very simple ways that you can bring the complaint in these kinds of mechanism. You don't need to pay a court fee. You don't need a lawyer. You just go and tell, because communities, they have like system, they know what's happening there. They are the witness. They know the proofs and everything else. So it's very easy if somebody, some wrongdoers, they can easily confess that what happens there, right? So and they clearly monitors and the decision, and mostly it's a restorative justice. If you looked about the decision of the Supreme Court, the record shows that 60% of the decision has, it's not implemented. So there is gaps. So fulfill that gaps, there is alternative mechanism that has to be recognized. I guess the two international instruments, UN DRIP, ILO Convention 169, as our colleague mentioned from Finnfund, there is alternative that can be recognized, but it's not only the government has to recognize, but the other international organizations or international partners. In that regard, KIOS and LAHURNIP, we are doing some sort of studies, and we came up with some studies that shows that there is the potential things, and then that can fulfill the gap. Right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I think we will now end this session, but what I take from what you are saying is that there is really an important statement to be made, is that national legislation are unfortunately really lagging behind and are not enforcing or protecting or implementing well indigenous people rights, and this is also the case in the Nordic countries, in fact. So we need really to reinforce international standards, to put pressure on national states to improve those framework, and also to create space for indigenous people rights and law and system to be supported and protected at the national level. There are many issues that I wish we would have the time to discuss, but unfortunately I think I have to end this panel session. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope we can continue the discussion around coffee.